Hello, everyone, and welcome to Past and Printed, the show where we take a look at a newspaper from today's date, but in a randomly selected city, in a randomly selected year, to see what people at the time were reading about and what was going on in their world. I'm your host, Lloyd, and for our first episode of our second season, we're up in the Great White North and some of the northest of the North at that, looking at the Friday, March 7th, 1941 edition of the Whitehorse Star from Whitehorse, Yukon Territory. As usual, let's get a quick history and a few facts about Whitehorse. Whitehorse is situated along the Yukon River in the southern portion of the Yukon Territory, about 150 kilometers north of the U.S.-Canadian border, and about 175 kilometers from the Alaskan tourist town and former gold rush jump-off point of Skagway. Archaeological evidence suggests that indigenous people used the area around Whitehorse for seasonal fish camps, specifically the southern Tutchone, Tagish, and Tlingit people, and in 1883, U.S. Army Lieutenant Frederick Schwatka noticed indigenous portage trails in the area. When gold was discovered in the Klondike region of the Yukon in 1896, thousands of prospectors arrived in the area and many camped in the area around Whitehorse Pass. By 1900, this camp had developed into a permanent settlement, boasting multiple mercantile stores, a hardware store, 6 hotels, 2 drugstores, a brickyard, 3 churches, an athletic club, an electric plant, and thousands of square feet of warehouse space. The settlement had colloquially been known as Whitehorse, often spelled as 2 words, and Territorial Commissioner William Ogilvie officially cemented that name in 1901. In 1920, 4 de Havilland DH-4 biplanes en route from New York to Nome, Alaska, became the first aircraft in the Yukon when they landed at Whitehorse. The first airmail delivery started in 1927, and until 1942, river, railroad, and airplane were the only ways to get to and from Whitehorse from elsewhere in the world. In 1942, tens of thousands of American service members and civilian workers arrived in Whitehorse to construct a road from the mainland U.S. to Alaska, now known as the Alaskan Highway. The American Army maintained that road during the war and for 6 months after, when control was handed over to the Canadian military and the road was opened for tourist traffic in 1947. Between 1941 and 1951, the population of Whitehorse increased from around 750 to nearly 2,600 due to the Alaskan Highway facilitating easier access to the region, and therefore expanding mining, prospecting, transportation, and tourist industries in the area. Despite being a major settlement in the area for over half a century, Whitehorse had no elected municipal government until it was incorporated on August 4th, 1950, and in 1953, the city was designated the capital of Yukon Territory. Mining and tourism remain the primary industries around Whitehorse, as well as a growing real estate market. In 1941, the official population of Whitehorse was 754, and as of 2025, the city was home to an estimated 30,970 people. As of this edition, the publisher of the Whitehorse Star was Horace E. Moore, and a yearly subscription was $3, or about $59 in 2026. And just a quick note, as with all Canadian newspapers, the inflation conversion that I do is done in Canadian dollars unless otherwise noted. And with that, let's go ahead and dive into the Friday, March 7th, 1941 edition of the Whitehorse Star. First off on page 1, we've got local sports news. Starting off with curling, where apparently 3 teams are in contention for the UDL prizes. The article doesn't say what UDL stands for, but I have reason to believe that it's referring to United Distillers Limited, a distillery based in Vancouver at the time. I know that a United Distillers Limited team played in the British Columbia Amateur Baseball League at the time, so it wouldn't be unreasonable that they would sponsor curling prizes as well. However, this is just educated speculation on my part, so if anyone knows for sure what UDL would be referring to as the sponsors of curling prizes in 1940s Canada, let me know. Teams are also competing for the Culbertson Shield, which is awarded to the skip or captain of the winning team, and Gilby medals, which are awarded to the other members. The second prize in the tournament is a case of Carnation evaporated milk. At the time, the leading teams are W. Taylor's Rink, comprised of Mrs. A. Taylor, P. Delgarno, H. Perchie and W. Taylor as Skip, and the Wilson Rink consisting of Dr. Ruth, E. Wasson, A.J. Watson, and D. Wilson as Skip. They don't list the third team that they were talking about. It also appears the tournament will continue through March 20th. In hockey news, the Town team, that's Town with a capital T, suffered their first loss of the season on Sunday, March 2nd, when the White Pass team chalked up an extra goal in overtime for a final score of 6-5, making it White Pass's first win of the season. Quote, 2 members of the winning team went to the hospital for minor injuries, unquote. So in a recap, in the first period, despite an apparent save by White Pass goalie Bert Sansom, a shot from Town's Ian Murray was declared to have crossed the line by goal umpire Blondie Robinson. This was followed up by Laurie Todd weaving through the White Pass defenders and giving Town their second goal with a shot behind Sanson. In the second period, White Pass's Broad Sir took a shot from center ice, which bounced and fooled Town's goalie Ted Richards for White Pass's first goal in 8 weeks. This was followed up by 2 goals from Bob Dellert to put White Pass up by 1, but Town quickly responded with a shot by Nipper Murray to even up the score. White Pass's Jimmy Norrington spent a few minutes out of the game with a cut above his eye. Then in the third period, after, quote, hard checking and better passing, unquote, Bob Dylan and Broad Sir each scored another goal for White Pass, and John Phelps got 2 for the Town, bringing the score to 5-all as the game went into overtime. In OT, both Town's Fred Blaker and White Pass's Jimmy Norrington received minor penalties before Bob Dellert, with his 4th goal of the game, sewed up a win for the White Pass, breaking their 8-week losing streak. Then there is a picture of 4 Canadian airmen with a caption, 4 of the first pilot observers trained in the Empire overseas, photographed on their arrival in London to take up duties with the British Air Force. Of course, by 1941, Canada had been at war with Germany since September of 1939 and at war with Italy since June 1940, so there will surely be some more war news further on in the paper. The rest of page 1, however, is social news. First up, with a little news around town, Mrs. Isabel Scott, née McPherson, arrived on a visit to her parents on Tuesday. Mr. Scott, the paper is informed, will be arriving later. Edward Borders arrived here, that is White Pass, on skis from Fairbanks on Tuesday en route to Hazelton, British Columbia. A report of his trip, written by himself, will appear next week. And the T.C. Richards transportation stage arrived back from Dawson at 4 o'clock Wednesday afternoon. Then we have an article titled Donald McKay, Popular Co-Pilot Married at Coast. By co-pilot, they're not actually referring to an airplane pilot, but to a riverboat pilot. So someone who navigates and steers vessels through various hazards of rivers and inland waterways. This particular pilot, Donald McKay, was married on February 18th in Vancouver, British Columbia, to Miss Margaret McRitchie, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Norman McRitchie of Vancouver. The ceremony was held at the Highland Church and conducted, quote, in strict accordance with the ritual of the old Scottish Kirk, unquote, meaning the rituals of the Church of Scotland. The reception was held at the Peter Pan Ballroom on West Broadway and attended by over 200 guests, many of whom are well known around Whitehorse, including Captain and Mrs. Colin Campbell, Captain and Mrs. H. Morrison, Captain and Mrs. MacDonald, Mr. and Mrs. Alexander McIntosh, Dr. and Mrs. Neil Stewart, and Mr. Alex Halkett. The couple then left for Victoria, British Columbia for their honeymoon and will spend this summer in Whitehorse. The Whitehorse Star, quote, extends to the bridal couple the heartiest congratulations and the very best of wishes for their future welfare and happiness, unquote. And that's it for page 1, so let's cruise on over to page 2. The second page starts off with a column titled Foreign Press in Canada, which is apparently extracts from foreign language newspapers throughout Canada. The Star believes that these extracts are proof that, quote, the so-called foreign element throughout the Dominion have the right idea about their Canadian citizenship and the responsibility therein involved, unquote. The first excerpt comes from Der Nordwesten, a German-language weekly paper from Winnipeg, and is titled Our First Allegiance. The writer asserts that whatever ties of kinship and sentiment their readers have to other lands, Canada must claim their first allegiance, and in so doing, they will make it, quote, more difficult for undesirable elements to establish themselves among us, unquote. The readers of Der Nordvesten are asked to, quote, put into deeds and action the words of the national anthem of the Dominion, O Canada, we stand on guard for thee, unquote. The second piece, All Must Help, is from the Nardonia Gazeta, a Ukrainian weekly paper from Winnipeg. This author states that workers and farmers of Canada must stand in solidarity, quote, with the British working class, firmly and unswervingly on the defensive positions of our country, and this must be manifested by deeds and not by words, unquote. This sentiment is echoed by the Croatian papers Glas Kanada and Hrvatski Glas, please forgive my Croatian pronunciation. They declare that it is the duty of their readers to help win the war, and are convinced that, quote, every Yugoslav will now, according to his ability, regularly put aside part of his earnings to buy war saving certificates, and that the salvation of the world depends on a victory of Great Britain and of democracy in general, unquote. Directly following these dedications of loyalty and support for the nation, there is a section titled Canada's War Effort, which is made up of items from the week of February 20th through 27th. The Honorable C.D. Howe, Minister of Munitions and Supply, announced that 10 major divisions of munitions production and general equipment, construction, shipbuilding, chemicals, mechanical transport, shells, and steel production are all ahead of their production schedules. Aircraft production is behind, but, quote, rounding into shape, unquote. The Canadian government is establishing air bases at Grand Prairie, Fort St. John, Fort Nelson, Watson Lake, Whitehorse, Prince George, and Smithers to provide facilities for aircraft traveling to Alaska from Canada or the U.S. Over $7 million in war saving stamps and certificates were pledged in the first 22 days of the savings campaign. That's about $137 million in 2026. And the objective of $10 million, or nearly $196 million these days, per month will be, quote, passed by a substantial amount, unquote. Tragically, Sir Frederick Banting, co-inventor of insulin, was killed in a military plane crash near Musgrave Harbor, Newfoundland. Sir Frederick was apparently on a mission to Great Britain, quote, of high national importance, unquote. This obviously wasn't mentioned in the paper, but Banting was actually on his way to the UK to work on the Franks flying suit, which was the first ever G suit, which is like what fighter pilots wear to prevent them from blacking out or losing consciousness due to heavy G forces. Leighton McCarthy was appointed as Canadian Minister to Washington, or the top diplomatic official of Canada in Washington, D.C. He replaced Loring Christie, who had left the post due to illness. Mr. Christie, unfortunately, would pass away less than 2 months later on April 8th, 1941. R.G. Birkinshaw, General Manager of Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, was appointed as General Director, Priorities Branch, Department of Munitions and Supply. His job, essentially, is to make sure that government war requirements have priority over all other manufacturing. In that vein, contracts awarded by the Department of Munitions and Supply as of February 14th numbered 1,719, totaling $8,670,381, or $169,713,729.87 in 2026. First call was issued for 4 months compulsory military training. The call applies to single men and childless widowers who reached the age of 21 on or after July 1st, 1940. Previous calls had been for only 30 days of training. The next section is a little meta, I guess. It's titled 30 Years Ago and contains snippets from the March 3rd, 1911 edition of the Star, back when it was known as the Weekly Star. So apparently, in 1911, a new pulpit and 2 fine altar chairs were installed at the Church of England, gifts of Mr. W.H. Jeffrey. Active operations are in full swing at the Big Thing mine, and ore shipments are being regularly made. Work on the Long Tunnel is said to be progressing most satisfactorily. Homegrown eggs are a luxury which several local families will enjoy this summer, as several have sent out for live chickens. Burns & Company will also bring in a large shipment of, quote, live ones, unquote. packets of Yukon gold, that is, actual gold, not potatoes, and registered letters to the amount of $38,000, or about $60,000 in 1941 and over $1 million these days, had mysteriously disappeared from the mail on the last trip of the Princess Beatrice from the north. All the registered mail was cleaned out. There is no clue to the robbers. And just to note, the Princess Beatrice was a steamship of the Canadian Pacific Railway, which operated between Victoria, British Columbia, and Seattle, Washington. So I think that this implies that at some point between Victoria and Seattle, someone had made off with a bunch of gold and mail. Mr. and Mrs. George Armstrong entertained on Wednesday night at Bridge a la Chinese, the room being decorated with Chinese lanterns and the ladies wearing Chinese quote-unquote festoonings in their hair. The guests were received by a servant, Ace High McPherson, dressed in Chinese attire. I'm sure that was tasteful. Chop suey and other oriental refreshments were partaken of with chopsticks. The entire affair was unique, pretty, and interesting. So those are the news items from 115 years ago in a newspaper from 85 years ago. And with that, we are on to page 3. The vast majority of page 3 is dedicated to an essay described as Talk Number 10 in a series titled Hitler's New Deal for Labor in Germany. The article in the series it belongs to are sponsored by the BCEL, which is another acronym or abbreviation that I haven't been able to find a definitive definition for. For some reason, the Whitehorse Star seems to hate defining any of the abbreviations they use, and frankly, that's very inconsiderate of them to not assume that 85 years in the future, some nerd would be trying to summarize their newspaper in a high-tech radio program. Seems the talk itself was broadcast on the radio because it mentions quote-unquote letters from listeners. Regardless, the essay is a critique and ultimately a rebuke of the idea that Hitler's rule has been beneficial for the German working class. In fact, the writer flat out states that, quote, Hitler has brought ruin and slavery to the German working classes. What he has done for the capitalists and industrialists is another story, unquote. The writer asserts that Hitler's rise to power could not have been possible without the support of, quote, the German capitalists and financiers and industrial barons, unquote. It's pointed out that 5 years after Hitler rose to power, the average dividend of shares on the Berlin Stock Exchange had increased from 3% to more than 6%, and thousands of traded companies had gone from being 2 billion marks in the red to showing 1.25 billion marks in profit, all while most democracies were struggling with the effects of the Great Depression, and yet Hitler still declared Germany a have-not nation. However, apparently this economic success doesn't seem to have been passed along to the German consumer, with profits on consumer goods having increased by 130%, though the speaker muses that maybe the German public deserves some price gouging for preferring guns to butter. On that note, the German steel and armament producers Krupp, who exist to this day mainly in those same industries, had in 1934 nearly doubled their gross revenue from the previous year when Hitler had come to power, and declared a 60% dividend of gross revenue. Quote, not bad for the armament barons of a have-not nation, unquote. In contrast, the essay points out workers such as those for IG Farben, the German chemicals conglomerate that existed well into the 21st century, saw their annual wages decrease from 2,500 marks in 1930 to 2,200 marks in 1936. Meanwhile, their weekly working hours increased from 42 to 48.5 hours. In another example, a textile manufacturer wanted to decrease their workers' wages by 35%, and a quote-unquote trustee from the German Labor Front, that is a government organization which forcibly replaced all independent trade unions in Nazi Germany, was brought in to represent the workers. However, the trustee's only solution was to simply split the wage reduction into 2 stages, to which the author quips, and if the workers don't like it, well, there's always the Gestapo and a concentration camp around the corner. And it's not just wages. The speaker points out that millions of German workers were paying in installments for their new people's automobile, the Volkswagen, only to be informed that they wouldn't come into production until after the war. Quote, Hitler's promises to his own people are beginning to mean just about as much to them as they do to us, unquote. Of course, while the German workers have, quote, hiled themselves into the most appalling slavery and serfdom ever known, unquote, the Nazis' conquest of Europe has also enslaved millions of people in other countries, and replaced freedom of speech and freedom of association with, quote, power and profit for the few, serfdom and slavery for the workers, unquote. They conclude that Canada's main objective should be, quote, the complete destruction of Hitler and all his evil dreams of world domination based on the enslavement of the worker, unquote. The readers and listeners are encouraged to help achieve this objective by lending their dollars to the government in the form of war savings bonds and the like to, quote, provide Britain with the tools to finish the job, unquote. This is an interesting piece to me for a couple of reasons. First, I think a lot of modern audiences would probably brand this as a leftist or even socialist essay. Highlighting support for Hitler among Germany's industrial elites isn't really something that you hear about in the kinds of casual conversations that tend to happen about World War II, and blatantly calling out capitalists is certainly not something you would hear talked about on the History Channel. However, I do think that a lot of people seem to forget how prevalent organized labor was in North America for most of the 20th century. It's still more common in Canada than it is in the US, but down from its peak, especially amongst good-producing industries like manufacturing and mining, that sort of thing. But there was still plenty of anti-communist sentiment even among the working class. And in fact, the Defense of Canada regulations, which began in 1939, banned the Communist Party of Canada as well as affiliated organizations and publications, along with fascist organizations and their newspapers. Though these restrictions were lessened after the Soviet Union joined the Allies in 1942, the Canadian government still continued to outlaw certain left-wing organizations for the duration of the war. Honestly, from reading a little more about these regulations, I think it's actually a little ballsy of the Star to print this, and I'm assuming that both the speaker and the paper were able to cover their asses a little bit by including that call for workers to contribute financially to the war effort at the end. At the same time, many working-class people did support policies like public ownership or heavy regulation of certain industries like railways and banks, and New Deal-style policies like minimum wage and unemployment insurance. Basically, in the first half of the 20th century, being anti-capitalist didn't necessarily mean being pro-communism or socialism. It just meant there was a higher degree of class consciousness and worker solidarity than I think tends to exist in our modern times. Second, and this may have been obvious to you, but while the essay does talk about Hitler's conquest and dreams of conquest as enslaving the workers of Europe, and frequently mentions the Gestapo and concentration camps, aside from one mention of, quote-unquote, the master race, there is no attention given to the ethnic violence perpetrated by the Nazis. Of course, the enormity of the Holocaust wouldn't become common knowledge until much later in the war, and even the term genocide wasn't coined until around 1944. But it does seem that many left-leaning writers of the day, especially those attempting to reach a working-class audience like this speaker likely was, would tend to frame their critiques of Nazism and fascism in economic terms, framing workers as potential victims if Hitler isn't soundly defeated. And frankly, this is rooted in anti-Semitism, which obviously is still a problem today, but was even more common and normalized back in the 1940s, so many writers may have felt that focusing on Jews and other ethnic minority victims would actually lessen the impact of their anti-fascist rhetoric and reduce sympathy for the victims of Nazism. So while focusing purely on the class struggle of democracy versus fascism seems morally insufficient, it wasn't uncommon through the early years of World War II. So yes, that is the BCEL's critique of Hitler's supposed New Deal for Germany's workers. Aside from that, on page 3, and once again in the spirit of defeating fascism, there is a picture of some British soldiers with 3 captured Italian generals, accompanied by a snippet describing British victories in the Western Desert. The Brits have apparently swept the Italians from Egypt and Libya, capturing nearly 40,000 prisoners, almost 25,000 of whom are, quote, Italian officers and other ranks, unquote. And with that, we will sweep ourselves over to the 4th and final page. And on page 4, we start off with a column of news snippets from fellow Yukon settlement Mayo, which is about 400 kilometers or roughly 250 miles north of Whitehorse. At the time, Mayo was the main supply and administrative center of an expansive mining district in northern Yukon, but was only accessible via river until the 1950s. As such, much of the supplies going to Mayo and the silver coming out went through Whitehorse, making the two towns economically and culturally linked. So, what's the news from the Mayo area? Well, Herbert Lovedoll is preparing to leave for Haney, British Columbia, where he has acquired a fur farm. Councilman Gordon Lee conducted services at St. Mary's Church recently. Instead of a sermon, a film, The Life of Jesus, was shown. So basically like when you have a substitute teacher in school. Fred Taylor of Dutch Gulch has purchased the Lovedoll House in West Mayo, I assume the home of the departing Herbert. The deal included the furniture and effects, as well as grocery stocks, other property at the Calumet, which is a nearby mining camp, and a Ford car. 17 local skiers made an exciting trip to 5 Mile Lake last Sunday. Strung out in 3 lines, they were whisked to their destination, hitched to Charlie Taylor's car. Hot Stove Douglas is prospecting at Indian River this winter in search of the elusive metal. He is located about 8 miles from Quartz Creek, and I'm guessing by the elusive metal they mean gold. The Mayo chapter of the IODE, that's the Imperial Order Daughters of the Empire, a Canadian women's charitable organization, has so far donated $1,506.06, or about $29,500 in 2026, for war purposes, according to a report published in the Mayo Miner. Reverend R.S. Boyd, rector of St. Mary's Church, has left for Dawson to take over the duties as rector of St. Paul's there. He expects to be absent for 6 weeks. So I hope they had enough religious-themed films till he got back. Mrs. S.M. Wood was recently taken suddenly ill and had to be removed to the hospital for a short time. Her husband, the mining recorder, was away on a trip to Haggard Creek at the time. Mrs. Wood, however, is now feeling better and has returned home where she will rest quietly for the next few weeks. Tommy Jackson, pioneer hotel man of the Yukon, Edward J. McKenzie, former chef at the Elsa, and Elmer Palmer, who has been employed at the Calumet for the past few seasons, have left for other destinations. Mackenzie is heading for Fairbanks, Palmer for Vancouver to take a course in welding, and Jackson is leaving for the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota to undergo medical treatment. Joe Walsh, a longtime resident of the camp, has been escorted to the Dawson RCMP barracks, that's the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, where he will be retained pending the holding of the territorial court this summer. He is charged with writing a threatening letter to a pioneer official of the Treadwell Yukon Corporation in Mayo. And that's going to do it for the news from Mayo. Moving on, possibly an illustration of what I was talking about earlier regarding attitudes about pro-worker solidarity being coupled with anti-communism, there is an excerpt from another Ukrainian language newspaper, the Canadian Farmer from Winnipeg, which declares that, quote, "Communism has gone definitely bankrupt forever, and this fact should be realized by all Ukrainians who once believed in that doctrine," unquote. They go on to assert that if communism was viable, it would have been enacted throughout the world, which, flaws of communism aside, I think kind of oversimplifies the situation, ignoring the opposition by, monarchists, fascists, not to mention capitalists. However, the writer believes that only quote-unquote Soviet terrorism keeps communism in place in Russia, and that before the banning of the communist press in Canada, there were around 10,000 Ukrainian Canadian supporters of the Communist Party, but that only around 1,000 to 1,500 were full-fledged members. The balance being made up of, quote, Ukrainian farmers and workers who had been duped by communist press propaganda, unquote. And finally, there is a photo of recruits of the Royal Ulster Rifles in drill formation, with a caption stating, "No part of the British Empire is more loyal than Northern Ireland, where men have always sprung to arms at the call of Britain," unquote. And that is going to do it for the Friday, March 7th, 1941 edition of the Whitehorse Star from Whitehorse, Yukon Territory, Canada. I think this was our first World War II era paper, and despite it not being particularly chock full of content, I found it quite interesting, because as an American history nerd, I feel like I know a fair bit about the home front in the U.S. during World War II, but I know very little about Canada during the war, so seeing a little glimpse into that was kind of cool. And I hope you found that interesting as well, and if you did, please consider subscribing on whatever platform you're listening on. I'm excited to be starting up a second season, and very much looking forward to bringing you even more news from the past. And while I usually like to read out an ad from whatever newspaper we're covering, there's not many ads in this one, or not really fun ones, being a very small size paper, but I can tell you that Pacific evaporated milk is irradiated, of course. So thanks again for listening to Past and Printed. I've been your host, Lloyd, and I hope your next news is all good news.